Good evening, everyone. Is that microphone working all right? Welcome to tonight's Research Tuesday at the University of Adelaide. The event is Firing Debate. My name's Associate Professor Patrick O'Connor. I'm from the Centre for Global Food and Resources at the University of Adelaide. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this land that we meet on, which in this place was once red gum woodlands and blue gum grey box woodlands, is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we acknowledge their continuing association with the land and their leaders past and present. Tonight we turn our attention to what is probably for many people one of the major events of the past 3 or 4 months that we've been through, where the bushfires impacted us directly or through our connection to the media, people that we know, and the aftermath. So that the bushfires have been a very big event in South Australia, but also across much of Southeast Australia and in fact beyond into Queensland, starting even earlier than that. I want to start by acknowledging that there's a lot of trauma for Australians about those bushfires, particularly Indigenous people, but also for other people who are associated with the livelihoods and lives on those landscapes, the loss of human life, the devastating effect on environments and wildlife, the impact on businesses and just people going about their lives, and probably not made easier by the follow-up of a coronavirus and concerns about where that takes us next. But tonight what we're going to focus on is a journey through some ideas about what's going on with those bushfires. Where do they come from? What's happening with them? How do we feel about them? How do we think about them? And so we're going to explore a bit about bushfire history, understanding of bushfire risks, and how to manage these risks in the future. We've got 4 experienced, passionate researchers tonight who will lead the discussions. They come from very different disciplines, so they're going to bring a perspective from a range of research backgrounds, and collectively represent a very large amount of research experience, of concentrated interest in what the world knows about these things, and then their own research in adding to that. And the way that we will do that is that we will have the 4 speakers speak to us in series, and then we'll have a series of questions that have been formulated from those that many people who registered provided to us. And if we have time, we'll go to the audience for a few extra questions. So I'm going to introduce the speakers first, and then they can come to the stage one after each other. Our first speaker will be Professor Bob Hill, who's the Director of the University of Adelaide's Environment Institute and is a former winner of the Clark and Burbidge medals, respectively from the Royal Society of New South Wales and the Australian Systematic Botany Society. He's authored over 200 referees papers and 35 book chapters, and has a wealth of knowledge in the paleobotany and Australian flora. After that we'll have Associate Professor Douglas Bardsley. Doug's acting head of the Department of Geography, Environment and Population. His research focuses on climate change impacts on socio-ecosystems, both in Australia and internationally, including fire risk management. Douglas will be followed by Professor Holger Meyer, who's an environmental engineer in the University of Adelaide School of Civil, Environmental and Mining Engineering. He's also a research leader in the area of decision support and natural hazard risk reduction within the National Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. And the final speaker will be Associate Professor Melissa Bray, who's interim head of the University of Adelaide's School of Social Sciences. Melissa's research focuses on how to engage communities in environmental decision making, particularly in the context of climate change and biodiversity protection. Each guest will give us their short presentation, followed by the panel discussion and any other questions. I'd now like to invite Professor Bob Hill to the stage.
Thanks, Patrick. Okay, hope you can hear me all right. So I'm a botanist by training. I didn't choose to be a zoologist because I couldn't cut up animals. There's a huge human tragedy that's just taken place across Australia as a result of these fires, and I'm going to talk about the vegetation, but it is worth also pointing out the loss of animal life as a result of this fire, and I just put that first 3 words up there. Not counting invertebrates, the best guess is that 1 billion animals have been lost during the course of the fires over summer in Australia. And in social media, that's quickly moved from being 1 billion animals to 1 billion souls. The important point is each one of those animals would have suffered enormously during that. The tragedy here is far beyond the human, and it's important that we don't forget that. So fire has often been called a global herbivore, and there's evidence that we've had fire in the ecosystem on Earth for as long as we've had plants on land that could burn. So once plants came out of water, where they first evolved, moved onto the land, fire became an important part of what their whole ecosystem. That carried on until we reached the point where flowering plants evolved, and flowering plants dominate the landscape today, so they're the things we're most familiar with. And it's clear now that fire played a critical role in the early evolution of flowering plants, and that's important in understanding what's going on today. So in order for fire to be in the environment in an important way, you need 3 things. You need an ignition source for the fire, you need significant amounts of fuel, and you need fuel that's dry enough to burn. The thing that's important here is how dry is dry enough to burn. And I've put up a diagram here that might give you some idea of what can change through very deep time. So in this graph, there we go, the atmospheric oxygen level today is the green line that runs through there, and this graph runs back to 400 million years ago. You can see the black line shows you the past oxygen levels with fairly large error bars around them. It's quite a difficult thing to do, predict past oxygen. But the different coloured bands are really important. If you look down at the purple band, I mean the blue one is fire absent, if you have an atmospheric oxygen level around 13 to 15%, it's very hard to sustain a fire. If you have it between 15 and about 24%, you have something very close to current conditions where if the fuel is dry, a fire will burn, but if the fuel's wet, then it usually won't happen. Once you get above about 25% and up to 30%, you move into a very strange world which we wouldn't recognise, where any fuel will burn. There's enough oxygen that wet fuel burns, so fires are really common in the landscape as long as there's an ignition source. And we know that it's never gone above 30% oxygen because if it did, you effectively get spontaneous combustion and you have no terrestrial vegetation, and we do. So that hasn't happened. But for a lot of the past, you can see there, we were in the yellow zone, a very different situation to where we are today. And it's only in about the last 50 million years that we've dropped down here to something like current levels. But now things are changing. And they're not changing because the oxygen level's going up, they're changing because temperatures are increasing and rainfall is decreasing, it's getting drier. And so I've put that red arrow on the end, suggesting that our fire regimes are moving back up into those dangerous territories, not because of oxygen, but because of a change in the climate. So if you have a look at the Australian vegetation, over the last 50 million years or so, it's evolved to a really quite stringent fire regime. Australia has dried out through that time, and the vegetation has evolved strategies to survive through fire. And if you lump them together, you can turn those into 3 basic strategies. There's a large group of species that are fire intolerant, and we heard a bit about that over summer when the Gondwana Rainforests in New South Wales and Queensland burnt. A lot of concern about that because those have no capacity to come back after fire. There's a huge number of fire-resistant species, and I'll show you some of them. They have many strategies to try and return after fire without too much difficulty. And then at the really interesting end, there's fire-promoting species, mostly Eucalyptus species, and those are species that get a selective advantage from fire. And so it's in their best interest to make the fires spread further and burn more ferociously. Those are the really dangerous species when we get into hot fire conditions. I'll just quickly show you some examples. This is the mountains in Tasmania. That's a conifer subalpine forest. You can see the fire scar really clearly there. You can still step over it effectively, and that burnt more than 20 years before that photo was taken. So that's a vegetation that has absolutely no capacity to return after fire, and it's fire intolerant. There's another example. There's a lot of talk this summer that the Gondwana Rainforests were burning for the first time. Not at all. They've been burning for a long time in Tasmania and at some cost. So the aerial photograph on the left was taken in 1982. The green bit at the top is good Tasmanian rainforest. The brown bits around the edges are where it's burnt in that particular fire. And the yellowy coloured bits at the bottom are bare quartzite that once used to be rainforest, but it's been burnt out over many thousands of years. That also is fire intolerant vegetation. And if you look at the tree on the right, that's one of the dominant species in Tasmanian rainforest. That was growing in peat. You can see the peat has actually burnt away from the base of the tree. You can see little fragments of the peat. That's where it used to be. It's all burnt away. It's broken the connection between the roots and the main part of the tree, and that's a dead tree standing. There's nothing you can do about that one. Then fire-resistant vegetation, Xanthorrhoea or yuccas on Kangaroo Island, are one of the most amazing plants we have in terms of fire resistance. When they don't burn, they develop a dead thatch around. A dead thatch around the base here. When they do catch fire, that's full of volatile oils. That just explodes and creates enormous heat. The apex of these, which is buried right up in the top here, is quite well protected by all the leaf bases, and it survives the fire quite well. It's insulated from the heat, and so as you can see on the right, they recover vegetatively really well. They also have a flowering response. On the left here you can see these enormous flowering spikes they get. That happens after fire. Those spikes contain thousands of flowers, and the seed drops onto a nutrient-rich substrate. There's a lot of ash there, and there's plenty of light because the plants have been burnt out, and they go away very nicely following fire. So they've got two strategies. They can germinate the seed after a flowering response, and they survive vegetatively. Compare that to something like Banksia. Banksia produces woody fruits on the left here, and in many of the species they don't open every year, they just stay closed up, so the seed is retained in the cone. Then if the plant's burnt, the parent plant dies. The desiccation that follows forces the cones to open up, you can see that here, and release the seed onto the ash bed. That's a fire resistant strategy, and in this case you can see some of the seeds are still inside the cone, so they're about to be released. Most of them are gone. That was taken at Vivon Bay just a couple of weeks ago on Kangaroo Island. This is a great strategy for recovering from fire, but you lose the parent plant, so you have about a 15-year gap while this generation of plants grow up and flower themselves. Another fire during that time is devastating for that species, and it can be lost from the site. Fire-resistant vegetation, Acacia is another good example. They store their seed in the soil. When a fire goes through, it cracks the seed coat, and you see hundreds or thousands of acacia seedlings come up, and then a bit later, a few of them make it through to dominance. And sometimes acacia seed comes up on sites that no longer have adult acacias. The seed can last in the soil potentially up to a century. Then there's the fire-promoting vegetation, Eucalyptus. I'll just do this very quickly. The eucalypts have lots of strategies. One of them is epicormic shoots, dormant buds that sit under the bark on the eucalyptus. And if the eucalypt is damaged by fire or drought or insect herbivory, these shoots are released from dormancy, and you get this really characteristic clothing of shoots on the trunk. Over a period of time, just a few of those will assume dominance and create new branch systems, and eventually that tree looks just like a normal tree. And you can see a lot of that at the moment. Eucalypts also produce lots of seed. You can see on the left there, very tall eucalypt forest that's been burnt, and very healthy seedling regeneration underneath it from the hard woody fruits that retain the seeds. So what happens when fires become so intense that the seed store is destroyed and the existing plants are incinerated by the fire? This is the concern we have after this summer's fires. The fire-intolerant species stay fire-intolerant. The fire-resistant species have the capacity to become fire-intolerant. If the seed bank is destroyed by the fire, then we can lose those species from that site. That's a real concern. The fire-promoting species, by and large, are better adapted, and it's going to take a little bit more effort to get rid of them from the sites, but you can see signs that it's possible, and we could also lose them. So where's the evidence? This is Vivon Bay, just down or just to the east of Flinders Range National Park. This fire wasn't anywhere near as bad as Flinders Chase, rather. Here's the fire site. Here are the xanthorrhoeas coming back. You might be able to see the eucalypts have coppicing shoots all up the trunks, so they're live plants. That's where the Banksia was, and in this site it's releasing seeds, so we know the seed bank, at least for Banksia, has survived on that site. And there is some ash on the ground, and here are the remains of one of the billion sols that was lost. And there were animal skeletons everywhere at Vivon Bay, probably about one for every 5 or 6 square metres. It was quite confronting. Flinders Chase is another proposition altogether. It's quite shocking to see what's happened there. It's got a very spooky quality. The reason it's so pale is that it's all on sand. So that's the bare sand. There's no ash, there's no leaf litter, there's no animal remains. I suspect the animals have been totally incinerated there, which suggests extraordinarily high temperatures in the fires. And the fires are absolutely extensive. So the whole of Flinders Chase is effectively burnt. About half of it was burnt in 2007, and yet it's all burnt again. So having different ages since fire is a good strategy for fire up to a point, but it failed here. Despite this devastation, the eucalypts are coming back from shoots at the base. None of the above ground parts are alive with the eucalypts, but they've got an underground woody structure, a lignituber, and they're sprouting from there. So there is sign at least that the fire promoting species are coming back, but I can't see that there's any evidence of a seed store there, and I can't see how there can be. So the next few months will be an anxious wait to see if anything returns from seed. And there's no nearby vegetation to seed into it. The only seedlings that I could see in quite a long time looking was a small patch just by Remarkable Rocks. You can see on the left there, and I suspect those are weeds that have just somehow managed to survive the process. And that's it. There's been some good rainfall, there's been some reasonable temperatures, nothing else yet, and now we just get to wait and see. But there is a real chance here that we've seen a change in the fire regime, especially in extreme conditions. And if so, we've got some serious concerns on our hands. Thank you. Oops.
Thanks, Bob. We've heard very much about the ecological impact of fire. I want to talk about the social implications of fire, and particularly how our conceptions of risk are changing in relation to bushfire. And I'm going to start with some social theory, and I don't often present social theory in talks like this, but this is one of my favourite social theorists I've been following for some time, and his work really argues that we're moving into a time which is going to be increasingly defined by risk. He argued that we've had a first modernity, an era which was relatively easy, where we exploited technologies, natural resources and labour, but in that process we developed new risks. And now we're heading into a second modernity that is being increasingly defined by risk. So I want to go through some examples, and I'll use that framework as I do to think about how risky is this society that we're generating. Already we've talked a lot about climate change and bushfire in the Mount Lofty ranges, and there's been a lot of press this summer about the implications of that. For some time now, we have been looking at this question and looking how our systems here in the Mount Lofty Ranges and elsewhere in southern Australia are going to be increasingly exposed to a changing climate, and also we are highly sensitive to those changing climate. But I don't want to focus on climate change, I want to focus on another issue. But importantly, that climate change issue is driven by human modernity. It's the very success of our modern systems that have generated the greenhouse gases that are driving that change. So it fits his thesis. I want to focus more at the local or regional scale though. So I'm going to focus on planning our settlements in relation to bushfire. And if you look back historically at the development of the city of Adelaide, when it was established, there's strong evidence to suggest that the city was surrounded by quite open parklands and agricultural areas. Now, we know it's a lovely place to live in and around the forest, but the city has moved out to the forest, and arguably many of those suburbs are now forests. The very success of our modern planning system that has made us, Adelaide, one of the most livable cities on earth, is generating significant risk. We know now that we need to think differently to respond to those risks. There are real gaps in planning. And from some work we did with Guy Robinson, I think he's also in this lecture room, Delene Webber from the University of South Australia and others, we looked at how we can plan for risk. Already we know there's little requirement for our planning system to account for bushfire risk in relation to how we organise our suburbs. Not at the building scale. At the building scale we do quite well. But where we place our entire suburbs or urban developments, or where we organise our transport links, really don't take into account the potential for bushfire risk. There's no requirement in South Australia to inform new residents of the bushfire risk in an area where they're planning to live either. That might seem like an obscure requirement, but if you're not from South Australia, or if you're not from Australia at all, the knowledge of bushfire risk may be such an odd thing for you that you won't incorporate it into your planning. There's no requirement for conservation staff to be consulted even on new housing developments. So what we've seen is a series of housing developments on the border between the city and our conservation estate in the Mount Lofty Ranges, which run right up and against those conservation areas. So suddenly we have to change the way we manage the forest immediately adjacent to those. Then in these same landscapes, we wind slow-moving goods trains through the landscape, which can often cause traffic delays. So there are some big changes we could make in relation to those questions. We undertook a large survey of South Australians, about 1,000 respondents from Southern Eyre Peninsula and the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges, and we asked them how prepared they are for bushfire. Clearly, there are some people who are very, very prepared, and some that are quite prepared. But then there are within a group, both in the Lower Peninsula and in the Mount Lofty Ranges, there's a group that don't feel prepared at all. And I'll just quote this. Individual actions often do not translate into collective responses. We've individualised our settlement patterns. That is a modern structure. People don't necessarily know their neighbours, or they don't necessarily know other people within their landscapes. They're working as individuals. That might make people feel like they're prepared, but collectively, the community may not be. We delved down more into that particular data and asked, how does this relate to climate change risk? Are people feeling like they're being more exposed to bushfire risk because of the changing climate? About 2/3 of the community said, yes, we do feel that. A third said, no, we don't really feel like climate change is altering our bushfire risk. Half of those people who think climate change is increasing bushfire risk are responding. The other half aren't. So there's a sense there from within the community that risks are increasing, but the capacity to respond to those risks isn't there. And that's important. That's a gap that we can start to fill by working with those groups to start targeting communication in different ways for different groups of people. One of the responses that's been talked about a lot this summer is greater use of Indigenous burning within the South Australian landscapes. We've been doing quite a bit of research in this space. We recently published a paper where we reviewed the knowledge that's available to us within science on Indigenous burning within South Australia. And we concluded the academic knowledge on regional Indigenous burning practices insufficiently developed to warrant any strong claims to inform possible improvements in hazard and natural resources management. Now that's a conclusion that does not say that that Indigenous burning couldn't be useful, or it might not be very important in the future, but at the moment we've turned our back on that knowledge. And that's been another modern action. By turning away from traditional knowledge and prioritising modern knowledge, we basically have precluded ourselves from some very valuable sources of information that at the moment we don't have capacity to draw from. We've been working in the APY lands up in the northwest of South Australia as well. You can see in this map the very large bushfires that have passed over that region after the large, strong rains in 2011. Basically, most of the APY lands burnt. In that region too, bushfires are predicted to become more severe. Partly it's because of climate change, partly it's because they're getting increased fuel loads, but also because there's less traditional burning. But it is an area where the community still retains the capacity to implement traditional burning at a landscape scale. But there's a challenge now for South Australia, and in fact for Australia, because we're losing that knowledge. This is one of my favourite quotes, so I'm going to read it at length. In the past, old people walked around the country and knew the signs of changing weather patterns. Years ago, we used to know everything because we would go out on country all the time and feel the changes. Now we're just stuck in Armata. We used to look after country, but now we just look after the store. We need to understand people. People need to learn about country. Only a few young people are still hunting and understanding. We've been trying to work with communities there to integrate that knowledge into responses to a changing climate. And that's a process of social learning. That's recognising that our modern knowledge and how we apply it is vitally important, but we need to integrate it with traditional forms of knowledge and wisdoms that have come from a strong understanding of place and people within place, built up over many centuries. And we haven't done that much in Australia, and that's another gap that we can start filling. I'll finish with this quote, because this speaks to the question perhaps of where we can go, which is to invest into intact Indigenous community actions in relation to natural resource management. This country is us. Your country is what you eat from. Help us to live well, to keep all the plants and animals alive. We want support money to control our place. We don't want to get rich. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doug and Bob. So I'll talk to you a little bit about understanding future risk, not just the risk we're experiencing at the moment, but also more importantly, what we can do to minimise that risk in the future. And so trying to tie together some of the things Bob talked about the changing hazard around fire, and also Doug talked about people moving more into bushfire-prone areas, and also our lack of understanding how to deal with fires. So when we're dealing with fires or managing bushfire risk, it's been really shown that prevention is better than cure. And Helen Clark put it this way. She said it's better to park an ambulance at the top of a cliff than to build a fence at the top of the cliff than to park an ambulance at the bottom. But when you look at the spending at the moment, we're putting most of our money into ambulances and very little money into building fences. And the problem is because it's very hard to know where to build the fence, how high it should be, and when to build it. And so we need some sort of quantitative information that helps us to better understand where we should build these fences and so on. And so in order to do that, we need some quantitative information, and a good way to understand how that all fits together, and some of the elements Bob and Doug talked about, is the risk triangle. And so it's pretty obvious that without a fire, there wouldn't be a risk. But even if a fire occurs, there's no risk if nothing we care about is exposed to that. And Doug talked about people moving into bushfire-prone areas and also having animals and the environment exposed to that. That adds to the risk. But even if something is exposed to the fire, the impact or the damage is really a function of the attributes of what is exposed. And Bob talked about the adaptation capacity of plants. And if a plant's well adapted, then the risk is pretty low. But if the plant is not adapted, then the risk is high. And the same applies for people. You know, Doug talked about our capacity to really manage risk and understand it. And similarly for infrastructure, how well does the infrastructure respond to fires? What's the impact? So we need to look at all these things together to really understand risk. The problem is that in our society, it's more like a risk iceberg than a risk triangle. You know, we're very much focused on the hazard side, and you can see the discourse that happened, you know, after the fires this year. It's all about we need to reduce the fires, we need to do more planned burning, and that's all very important. But the risk is a function of all of these factors, and you know, and a lot of these risks down here to do with exposure and vulnerability, they sort of happen by stealth. You know, as Doug mentioned, we get population growth, people start moving into nice areas, and I think that the thing is, it's a lot of these things are driven by community values. You know, and as Doug said, you know, a lot of the planning regulations don't consider these things. You know, people don't deliberately move into a bush because it's a high-risk area. They move there because it's got high amenity value. They want to live in a beautiful place, and you can't blame them for that. But we need to understand that by doing that, we're building risk over time, and we're not really aware of it. And then when the ignition happens, when we get the fire, we all focus on the fire. But we need to look at all of these things together. When we're thinking about future risk, it's a little bit scary because when you look at all of these different elements that contribute to the risk, they're all getting worse, or the risk's increasing. And Bob's already talked about, and dark climate change is increasing the hazard side of things, so we're getting more extreme temperatures, we're getting higher winds, we're getting lower relative humidity. All of these physical factors contribute towards more fire. And having more people and having slow-moving goods trains through the hills are their ignition sources. They can spark the fire. So having more people also increases the risk of fire. And so that goes on the exposure there. We've got population growth and economic development. So we've got more people, more assets. It's not just people, it's buildings. It's also, you know, we need to think about vegetation as well. But all of these things are pushing into these bushfire-prone areas. If we have more people, they need to live somewhere. And in this particular point, we also need to think of not just bushfire risk in isolation, we need to think of other hazards as well. Because if you're thinking about where people are living and they have to live somewhere, if they don't live in the bush, they might live near the coast and get flooded with sea level rise. So we need to really think of these things holistically. And finally, we've got, in terms of vulnerability, we have low volunteer rates, we've got an aging population, and probably a greater disconnection with country, as Doug talked about. So all of these things are working together to increase our future risk. When you're thinking about mitigation then, how do we reduce that risk? We also need to look at all of these aspects of risk, not just the hazard or the fire part. And so we can do all these things, and Doug mentioned some of these. So we've got fuel load reduction is one way of reducing the hazard part. This could be planned burns, it could be indigenous practices, it could be mechanical fuel load reduction. There are lots of different things we can do to actually reduce the fuel load and the fire risk itself. But there was a productivity commission into natural hazards that reported in 2015, and their conclusion was the biggest single thing we can do to reduce risk is spatial planning. So this is land use planning. And as Doug mentioned, you know, that the fire component, the fire risk, is a very small component of that planning if it's considered at all. And so once you let people live in these bushfire-prone areas, it's very hard to reverse that. You've got a lot of social challenges. You can't just tell people to leave. And then finally, in vulnerability, you've got things like community education, people being better prepared, but also you can change building codes to make buildings more resilient to fires. So again, the point here is that it's a pretty complex space. So you've got lots of things going on. You've got 3 areas of risk. You have future drivers of change, so the climate, population growth, economic development, all of them increasing risk. You have a plethora of different options you can use to reduce risk. And so it's very difficult to know what the best mix is of these different options. The other thing that's complicated is that these vary spatially, so what's best in one location is not necessarily the best in another location. And other thing, they vary temporally. So some of these drivers of change occur at different time scales, but also the mitigation options. If you reduce the fuel load, the risk is reduced pretty much immediately. If you change a building code, that'll take 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years to come into effect. So it's a complex space. So in order to try and help, I guess, navigate governments through that space, we've worked with over 40 government agencies over the last 6 years to develop Unharmed. It's a unified natural hazard reduction exploratory decision support system. But basically the idea is really to help people explore all these different options and drivers to better understand risk, but also to try and mitigate risk in the future. And so the way it works is we look at all these three aspects of risk. And so in terms of hazard, you might look at the spatial distribution of the fire intensity. This is for the Greater Adelaide area. You might then overlay that with land use and building stock information. And so again, that gives you the exposure. You know, if you've got the hazard over here and you've got the exposure, and you could easily look at not just buildings here, you can look at environmental assets, you can look at social assets. We've done some social vulnerability work as well. And then in terms of vulnerability, this is really, so for example, this is for different building types. They have a bit different response or vulnerability to a hazard. So just very briefly, you know, this on the x-axis, we've got basically the intensity of the fire. And on the y-axis, it's really the damage that causes to that particular type of building. So 0 is no damage and 1 is complete destruction. And just for illustration, so different buildings have different types of these curves. And if you put all that together, you can then get a spatial distribution of the risk. In this case, we've looked at the average annual loss of just direct losses. Okay. So it just gives you an indication of how you can put all these things together to better understand risk. But all these things are not just maps, so we've developed models that helps us to explore some of these factors. So each of these you can dial, you can change, add some climate change or add different population growth, add different mitigation strategies to really understand how risk changes into the future and also how it is affected or mitigated by different combinations of strategies. And so, for example, in terms of mitigation, you can look at spatial planning impacts on the land use allocation. So if you put a different spatial planning map into our model, you can then see for the same population growth, people will be more likely to live in different areas, and then you can see whether that's more or less risky. So you can sort of test the effectiveness of spatial planning and also over what timeframes that might take come into effect. In terms of building codes, you can then basically, that changes the vulnerability curve. So you're changing the vulnerability curve of a building, whether you do it by retrofitting or whether you actually have different requirements for new buildings that can change the overall risk. In terms of fuel load reduction, or whether it's planned burning or indigenous practices, or whether it's mechanical fuel load reduction, that changes basically your, a lot of factors going to the bushfire risk model. So where the vegetation is, where the fuel is, the time since last fire, all these different things go into that model. And then also you can look at community education, which might also change your vulnerabilities and also might affect the ignition potential. And so when you look at changes over time, as I said, they're all models. We might look at the land use now and also the building stock at the present. But then if you run the model under a different scenario, you might see, look, this is what the land use distribution might be in 2050, given a particular zoning regulation and particular population growth. In terms of the land value, that might change in response to that, but also in terms of urban renewal and different building codes. In terms of the bushfire risk or fire intensity, this is what it might be at the moment, but with climate change, this might change into the future, and you can explore what these changes might be. And then finally, this is just a link from, there's a link between where people live and the ignition potential, so there is actually a dynamic link between population growth and the fire risk. And finally, you've got the average annual loss now and then what it might be in the future. The point here is that I guess we think of our decision support system like a policy wind tunnel. So before you mass produce a car, you test it under a range of conditions that car might be exposed to during its lifetime. And so in the same way, we can test our policies under a range of different futures. So a policy is like the design of the car. This might be the different combinations of risk mitigation strategies, be it a combination of planned burning and changing the building codes and zoning. And then the wind in the wind tunnel might be the different futures around climate change and population growth and different economic development scenarios. So it's really saying, will our strategies that we're putting into place now, are they likely to stand up in the future under all the conditions we're likely to be exposed to? So just the take-home messages, I think the immediate response is to think about the fire as the problem. And it's certainly an issue we can look at in terms of mitigating, but risk is much more than fire. And the biggest part of risk is really the exposure and the vulnerability. And if we want to reduce future risk or understand risk, we need to focus on those components as well. We need to take a long-term view. Some of these options, as I said, like planning or building code changes, take a long time to take into effect. And the actual risk we're experiencing now a lot of it is a function of decisions made by people in the past. If someone's allowed to let people live somewhere, or the building codes, all these things we have to deal with now. And it's the same if we want, the risk future generations will experience are a function of decisions we're going to make today. And so we need to think about those long-term things. The other thing is that it's really difficult. Mitigation's a hard sell. You think about, tell somebody, I've spent $10 million and nothing's happened, isn't it fantastic? No, it's not the same as the emotional response we experienced in response to the fires we've had. You can see the devastation, you can see the loss of property, the hardship. People are very generous, and which is fantastic. But we also need to think about how can we put money into mitigation, which is shown to be much more effective. And so the tools like the one we've developed helps you make a business case to actually understand what the likely benefits and costs are of different strategies now and into the future. And that really leads into this. We're very reactive at the moment. Something happens and we respond rather than being proactive and strategic in terms of planning for the future. And that's partly because we're dealing with 3-year political cycles, but really we need to think about the longer term and transcend that to really try and do what's best for our communities. And finally, we need to consider all the options. It's very natural for people to come up with, we should do more of this or more of that, more planned burning or more Indigenous practices or change the building codes. They're all excellent suggestions, and we need to consider all of these things, but we need to put them all together and say, look, what's the best mix of these in a particular location, given a particular future? And also the best time to make these decisions are not in a crisis. We need to plan when we can be rational and calm about it. But in general, my experience is whether it's water or fires, usually when the initial, when everything dies down after the initial event, then that comes off the radar and the political agenda, and that's really the time when we need to plan, rather than when we're just in an emotive state and responding to these things. So, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much again, and thank you to Bob and Doug and Holger for really setting the scene for my talk. South Australians are affected by climate risks, and they're hit at the very heart of their communities, and these communities are being hit all across Australia. Since the start of the bushfire season in September, an estimated 25.5 million acres have burned. At least 27 people have perished, and more than 1 billion animals are feared dead. An estimated 2,000 homes have been destroyed, with hundreds of thousands of people being evacuated. So my burning question is, how do communities adapt to this situation, both now and into the future? And the other speakers have talked about risk, we've talked about mitigation, knowledge and social learning. And what I want to look at is a different concept, which I work in quite a lot, which is both adaptation and adaptive capacity. And my argument is that whether it's adapting to climate change, rural migration, or indeed something like the coronavirus, we need to build adaptive capacity. So the first question around that is, I guess, what is adaptive capacity? It goes beyond resilience, which I think is a very overused and misinterpreted term, and it gives people a little bit more understanding of the nuts and bolts of what we need as collective societies and groups to work towards responding to these huge changes that we're facing. Officially, adaptive capacity, I mean, it also has lots of definitions, but this is the one that we work to. It refers to the ability of a human and indeed non-human systems to adjust to climate change, including climate variability and extremes, to moderate potential damages and to take advantage of opportunities or cope with the consequences. And to me, I mean, Doug's picked up a little bit on the idea of the learning capacity, and we've looked at, you know, things like how do you resource it, how do you get your fair governance and planning into those things. But I think one of the things I want to look at, and I'm very concerned about, is not only how do we build adaptive capacity, but how do we do it in ways where we live with, not against nature. And I'm going to talk about a few of what I think are the barriers to adaptive capacity, and then I'm going to end with what I think are some of the enablers of adaptive capacity moving forward. And one of the things that I've noticed in my research is that fear is a really big player. People are scared, and people in communities are scared, and therefore they become angry. And this fear leads to a sense of hopelessness, which is compounded by the fact that climate change is seen by what Van der Poel calls a problem of many hands. It has collective effects, it has collective responsibility for the problem, and its solution is often widely and unevenly distributed. And a lot of my work and Doug's work where you look at Indigenous communities, you find across the board the impacts of climate change are disproportionately unevenly felt, and therefore the solutions need to be delineated and differentiated a little bit. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I really think a lot of the issues around building adaptive capacity is that we suffer collectively from a fear of nature, which is often a fear unreasonably directed at nature as the culprit rather than also a victim of the problems and the emergencies. And I put this quote here from Ethel Turner, who also wrote 7 Little Australians. There was no sound anywhere, no twitter of wakening birds in the gum trees, no bleat from the sandy paddocks, no low of far-off cattle, silence. The frightful silence of drought that has killed all life and now broods over the place, aghast at her own handiwork. I think this is the feeling a lot of people have out about the fear of what happens in the Australian landscape, and it doesn't help us understand it. Competing communications are also really problematic. I speak to the Cassandras of our day. This is Cassandra on the left. She was a Trojan princess, sister to the more famous Helen of Troy, but she was doomed by Apollo to always speak the truth about the future but never to be believed. And I think that climate scientists suffer and are the Cassandras of our age, never being believed. And communities are befuddled by who to believe, what's real and what's not real. We have skeptics and we have activists, and the entire climate discourse is turned into an us and them. And then we have the conflicting messages of our leaders. This is Scott Morrison when he was Treasurer in Question Time coming in with a piece of coal, and he said soothingly, "This is coal, don't be afraid, don't be scared." And in February of this year, he actually left open the option of indemnifying a new coal plant in Collinsville from future carbon risk. This is confusing for communities, compounded by a 24-hour news cycle that continually regurgitates horrifying stories of grief and trauma in these communities, which, while they may be real, don't lead us into a sense of action or empowerment. And finally, I think an issue here is the individualism and disconnection. I've been reading a little bit about this idea called the attention economy. The attention economy is a theory that basically says the one thing that is in short supply these days is our attention, because it's so bombarded with everything else. And leading to that is this idea of narcissism, which again I hark back to ancient Greek mythology. Narcissus was an extremely scrummy, yummy young man who unfortunately thought he was really good as well. And he basically caught sight of himself in a pool and fell in love with himself and faded away and died. Now, this is not very helpful. This is the generation of the idea of narcissism, and it is, if you like, the ultimate selfie. But you can see there's been a lot of research done that's shown that the individualism and disconnection created by the attention economy, in fact, is causing not just disconnection from self and communities, it's causing disconnection from nature. And Pyle himself said, one of the greatest causes of the ecological crisis is a state of personal alienation from nature in which many people live. So what you might ask is, what has that got to do with bushfires? What has this got to do how communities can respond? I think what it means is that we need to, picking up on one of Doug's points about collective versus individual action, is that we need collection action, but we need it along socially pragmatic pathways, social just pathways that are going to enjoin communities to work together. We might have the technology, we might have the money, hopefully we have the insurance. We can try and work towards mitigation, but we're also facing situations where loss and damage exceed our capacity to move forward. So building adaptive capacity to work towards new futures is really important. And collective action is, as Doan states, instead of acting as though an absence of clear solutions absolves us of responsibility for participating in collective action, loosely structured groups might take their shared not knowing as a starting point for building their individual and collective problem-solving capacities together. That's what I'm moving towards, thinking would be a good way of addressing some of the issues on communities. I'm going to put up a few ideas, some pragmatic ones and some more thought-provoking ones. One of the things I think about fear is that it creates conflict, and then that creates disconnection, and that we could look at productively harnessing conflict as an energy to build governance. And, you know, don't be frightened of it, it's got a lot of bad press, but it can be seen as generating opportunity and growth. And in fact, some studies show that eliminating conflict will also eliminate potential learning and innovation, and therefore mitigating against fostering the kind of social learning that Doug was talking about. A related advantage to confronting and using conflict head-on is that it usually has the effect of bringing people together and creating mini-publics who can create feasible alternatives around controversial issues. And in fact, people exhibit a high degree of agency when faced with conflict and adaptively learn from each other about how to solve problems. And I like this quote from Laws, who says, "The heat of conflict can contribute to the active engagement of stakeholders who are willing to challenge the habits of thought and action, and whose emotion and commitment can inform and sustain a process of moral and practical learning." But what does that practical learning look like? Picking up on some of the comments earlier, I think building partnerships is really important. And I agree with Doug, and in the literature, it's a very nuanced question about how we might engage traditional knowledge into current fire burning practices. But that doesn't mean that we can't work across cultures. In Australia currently, there are over 1,000 Indigenous rangers and 600 ranger stations across Australia working on caring for their country. And in New South Wales here, there are 14 Indigenous rangers who were trained up by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service and are ready cohorts to go out and help build partnerships and help people fight these fires when they occur. Other people, such as the National Farmers Federation, have joined the Australian Climate Roundtable, and since these recent fires, Farmers for Climate Action have been established, which are asking people from all across rural Australia to push for more action on the effects that the climate are having on agriculture and the impacts that they're having, such as fires. So I think building partnerships is a tangible way forward. And this pragmatic collective action can also build adaptive capacity, because action is key to addressing fear. Breaking it down into smaller steps, nuggets, you know, as we say probably to all of our children, chunk it into bits, and you'll be able to get on top of things. Holger talked about volunteering. That's a big part of any community, and it can build social learning and build community cohesiveness across generations. The other thing that strikes me, I did a lot of research about this prior to this talk, is that there is a lot of information already out there for communities that can help them to proactively move into the future and build adaptive capacity. The Greening Australia, for example, has a green hub designed to build help for regional communities and has bushfire adaptation toolkits. The Australian Resilience Disaster Handbook has a series of community recovery case studies that highlights how rural communities, after the Black Saturday and the other fires, have actually successfully recovered and worked together to move forward. There's the National Association of Steel-Framed Housing, which has created an entire guideline on how, moving into the future, you can build houses that are fire retardant. And the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Framework has built a bushfire synthesis summary. There is ability for communities to come together around these guidelines to move forward. Another thing I think is really important is to communicate good news stories. In a 24-hour news cycle and with all the negativity that we can feel and the trauma that's being occurred, remembering that there are good news stories is important. This is just one I found from the GoFundMe in Kangaroo Island. Some of you will be familiar with it, some of you will have contributed to it. Their aim was $15,000, they got over $2.5 million. And basically they've built communications that are productive moving forward. They've built shelters, they're releasing animals into the wild. I think a bit more of this sort of productive good news would help a lot. So finally, I just wanted to end by saying I think one of the really, moving forward, there are practical ways, there are also wider ways societies can shift and move towards adaptive capacity. And finally, we could shift from having our attention grabbed from us to choosing to pay attention and reconnect both to people and to place. And that therefore we can construct the conditions that may make our attention our active activity rather than a passive one. And ones that pay attention to the ways of knowing of Indigenous peoples, that respect and work with fear of nature so that we don't fear it but work with it, and ones that get us to pay attention to each other so that we can build that social cohesiveness to work together, so that when the next fire comes, we are more climate ready, we are more prepared, and we know we're in it together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Melissa and everybody else. We're going to move to the chairs and have a bit of a discussion about some of the things that have come up there and some of the other issues that have come by extension from the questions that you've provided already, and then we'll see if we have some time for some more questions. Do we have some microphones to share? Thank you. Maybe Holger, if we start with you. There's a question in there about what's driving the changes that we saw, the big bushfire events of this season, and there's a lot of talk about climate change as a driver, but there are people who don't believe that climate change was the driver or don't believe in climate change at all. What do we know about climate change as a driver of the recent fires?
Thanks, Patrick. Is that? Yeah, that's on. Look, we can't definitively say that the fires were caused by climate change, but what we do know is that, if you look at the historical data, not just the projections, but we know that the physics of fires, the temperatures are becoming more extreme, winds are becoming stronger, we get more heat waves, so the relative humidity is lower and the ground is drier. So on balance, we know that we're going to get more extreme fires over time. That doesn't mean fires of this magnitude haven't occurred in the past. In Australia, we have an extremely variable climate, and so it's really hard for us to pick up any trends because if you wait long enough, you're going to get really extreme fires, but the frequency of more extreme fires is going to get greater. And so I think on balance, you can say, look, we're definitely as part of this trend. And on top of that, obviously, the impact will be greater if you've got more exposure and vulnerability as well.
Okay, thanks. And Melissa, what do we say to people who, when we are having these conversations, that they say that I don't think climate change is real or driving this, the changes that we're seeing in these big events?
I think that one of the things we need to say is to get people to focus in on what is the actual issue. And so most climate skeptics will still agree that there's drought, that there's flood, that there's fire. And so trying to talk about the ways to move forward, addressing the particular issues rather than dancing on the pin of whether or not it's existing as a climate change issue, I think helps a lot.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, I've got it. If I could comment on that as well, I don't think it's acceptable anymore to have someone say, I don't believe in climate change. You can have someone say, I don't want to believe in climate change, but for someone to say I don't believe it, it means they've read hundreds of thousands of pages of work by thousands of experts and have had the mental capacity to say that that work is incorrect. And it's no longer reasonable to take that from anyone, and especially people in power.
Thanks, Bob. one of the things that came up there, particularly in your talk, Holger, there was a discussion about the risk and exposure and vulnerability, and and that we focus on the fire. And so immediately and through the fire, there was already talk about, are we burning off enough? And there's different words used for that: burning off, prescribed burning, planned burning, and now the more common term is hazard reduction, which is a little twist on, if we burn more, we're going to reduce hazard. One of the questions, I guess maybe if I start with you, Bob, one of the questions is, if we start burning more, or if we want to burn more because we think that will reduce fuel loads, I mean, should we? What's going to happen if we try to take that approach?
Well, I mean, I guess in the past, the quite reasonable assumption was that if you had a mosaic landscape of different ages since fire, you were reducing the risk of a large conflagration really taking over everything. The concern now, though, is that at least in extreme years, and I hope what we've experienced has been an extreme year, not a new normal, that doesn't work. So at Flinders Chase, half Flinders Chase burnt in 2007 and burnt very badly. This year it all burnt. So, you know, only a few years later, certainly within the range that most people would have thought that was safe, the entire place was reduced to nothing. So it's a strategy that in the extreme years appears no longer to work.
And burning off, or prescribed burning, is a big impact on systems. So what do we know about ecological effects of adding burning or changing fire regimes?
Yeah, so I think what we do know is that there's no simple answer to it. It's different in every situation. So in the worst case, I know they did some work, I think in New South Wales, where they did a control burn through a eucalypt forest that had quite deep and compacted leaf litter, burnt it out. About 6 months later, most of the leaves fell off the eucalypts and produced a nice fluffy litter underneath that was far more likely to burn than what they had before. So there was a case where control burning simply made the problem worse. Now that won't always be the case, and there's no doubt a place for control burning, but it's not a simple fix. I certainly understand how someone who's experienced one of these fires, the gut feeling is, if only the fuel wasn't there, we wouldn't have had the problem. So it's a really natural reaction to have, but it's not necessarily backed by the evidence.
Yeah. Doug, you've done some work, and you started to talk about some of your work on how communities feel about fire. How do they feel about burning off, or prescribed burning, and increasing the amount of burn, which changes the aesthetic, changes the way that people can live in that landscape? You know, there are risks associated with burning off, including smoke inhalation and other things. What do we know about what communities want in that?
From our respondents, we found that most people have a very sophisticated understanding of prescribed burning. It isn't simply get rid of everything or don't do it any at all. People are tolerant of appropriate burning regimes, and that came through very strongly, and that's a very good story for the departments and the other agencies that are involved with those controlled burning. Where there's a particular risk is this idea that you've got to protect assets. And that's where you're going in, burning so regularly to try and reduce the fuel loads, rather than ecological burns, which are what a lot of the ecological systems are requiring as a regular stimulus for the type of species.
So it's recognising those trade-offs in the planning of fuel reduction.
People are open to that conversation. We're in our society, we're happy to have discussions about economics and social issues, but rarely about the complexity of ecological issues, when actually people are open to that discussion. That would be my argument.
So we might not be going straight into revenge burning, but there are other options. So burning isn't the only option, but we feel the fire, and we feel like if a fire had been through before under some control, it wouldn't be so bad now that it's uncontrolled in the summer rather than in the autumn. Holger, you started to touch there on some other options for fuel reduction, or modifying how fire might behave in the landscape at times of extreme flammability.
Yeah, it's not just extreme, and I think the fuel load reduction, Bob, it mightn't work under these extreme conditions, but if you get a less extreme fire that could otherwise cause a lot of damage, it might be effective. And so it's really, to me, it's horses for courses. It's looking at all these suite of options, but other alternatives include mechanical fuel load reduction. And so I know in Melbourne, for example, they use that in areas where there's, residential development close by, where it's just too risky or to do the burning, or even the smoke inhalation that Bob mentioned. And there are a lot of there's lots of trade-offs. I mean, the smoke affects not just, doesn't just have health impacts, it affects the wine industry potentially and the bee industry. So there are lots of trade-offs to consider. And so there is no simple answer. I mean, as Bob said, the gut reaction might be, yes, we need to get rid of the fuel load. But that only works under certain situations. Under extreme fires, it mightn't work. A lot of houses get burnt down from ember attacks, so it's not the fuel right next to your house. It's the embers coming from a few kilometres away, and also it's the fire start inside the house. So it's basically embers penetrating your house through the window or something, and then you get the fire inside the house. So there's a combination of having more fire resilient buildings with potentially some fuel load reduction, but also ultimately the only way you're going to reduce the risk to zero is if nobody's there or nothing you care about is in harm's way. And that's really the only way to reduce the risk to zero. Even if we do all these other things, the risk is going to, there's still a risk there. And also we're moving into an environment where we don't understand the risks as well because of all these changes that we're experiencing.
Thanks. The last 200 years of changes in our landscapes, Bob, maybe you can answer this, but what about somewhere like Kangaroo Island? So substantially the population there increased and the land was changed only really in the last 70 to 80 years for a lot of it. Were there, when we're talking about past fire regimes, how might the last 200 years have changed what would have been previous fire regimes to now be changing the way fire behaves?
Yeah, good question. I don't know that we really understand that. So what we don't really understand about Kangaroo Island is what the past fire regimes were. So there's the best way to do that is through coring sediments, and you can reconstruct year by year what had happened in the past. There's only one place that's been done on Kangaroo Island, at Lashmar's Lagoon, and about 2,700 years ago they had a massive fire on Kangaroo Island. It's a really interesting question. There were no Aborigines on Kangaroo Island when Europeans arrived. It's still unclear when they left. Was it before that fire? Was it because of that fire? There's a whole lot of questions we need to answer, and one of the projects we're currently trying to put together is to find places where we can core longer cores, get a longer fire history, so that we do have some sense of it, because Kangaroo Island is unique in Australia in being a large piece of land that wasn't inhabited when Europeans arrived. And so it is quite a different environment and one that needs special attention. So that's skirting around your question, but I think the answer is we don't really know.
Oh, that's right. So no Aboriginal settlement at the time of European colonisation on Kangaroo Island. But what about in other parts of the country where we have had, where we have now a real interest in cultural burning, in resuming cultural burning and cultural practices for mosaic burning and management in the landscape? How confident are we that reintroducing those kind of burning practices might help to manage fire regimes? Maybe Doug, you can pick that up.
I think there's some parts of Australia where they've done a lot of work and they've really developed a really good knowledge based on what they understand of modern burning practices in conjunction with traditional burning regimes. And that's where there's a confidence to move forward and apply those burning regimes in a sophisticated way. Work we've done suggests that South Australia hasn't done that same type of work. We really don't have, at the basis of our decision making about burning, a strong integrated knowledge system that we can draw from. That doesn't mean that traditional Indigenous burning practices wouldn't be useful in particular places, in particular contexts, but the landscape's changed enormously. We've carved it up with our settlement patterns, our transport, our other industrial activities. We've concentrated conservation in certain parts of the landscape, and other parts we don't have it at all. So it would need to be an integration of that traditional burning practices within a landscape that has differed substantially from where those systems were applied.
Melissa, do you want to add anything about cultural burning practice and its relevance in the future of how we manage these landscapes?
Well, I agree with Doug. I think that the knowledge that is available now is very differentiated, and it is patchy, and that's partly as a result of colonial invasion and then the changes, the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples, so that their knowledge has become fractured over the nation. And I think then asking them to produce that knowledge into this situation is additionally complicated because of the new regimes and the new challenges that we face. But as I said before, I think there's, as with Doug, there's lots of places in Australia where that knowledge is extant, it's surviving, and in Northern Australia particularly there's a very strong fire burning and successful fire burning program that's contributing to the carbon management of Australia with the Indigenous ranges there. So I think there's opportunities, but I think it's really important not to be naive about them or to fall into romanticised versions of what that all means, that we work together equitably and fairly in genuine partnership with Indigenous peoples where that can happen, and use that for the wider benefit.
Thanks. Holger, you talked a bit about planning codes and planning and building codes. Can we build our way out of fire risk?
No, I mean it's helpful. You can reduce the risk. That's the thing with all these natural events. You can't reduce the risk to zero. I really, one of my pet hates is people talking about fireproofing or floodproofing anything, because it's we're dealing with natural systems that are changing into the future, and we're really moving into territory we have no experience with. And as I said, we have got a highly variable regime in Australia, so if you wait long enough, you're going to get more extreme events. So I think it's got to be a combination of these things. Certainly, as I said, you can change the building codes and increase the fire resilience of buildings to stop embers getting into your house, for example. There's building materials you can use. There's lots of things you can use to protect your house. But in those extreme events, as Bob said, like in the same way as with planned burning, you really can't reduce it to zero. So I think we need to look at the trade-offs. It's all about trade-offs. It's about risk and cost. The more you reduce the risk, the more it's going to cost. How do you best target that spending? Where do you get the best bang for buck? What are the things you care about? Is it purely assets? Is it people? Is it the environment? All these things are on the table, and we rather than just throwing solutions at and saying this is the best, there is no silver bullet. Otherwise, we would have done it by now. It's a complex space. It's getting increasingly complex, and we really need to explore all the different options and look at the best mix in a particular situation.
So we just have to be smarter, more coordinated, plan better.
Yeah, all of these things, and the problem is
focus our resources.
And the problem is we've got a lot of residual risk. We've made decisions in the past, as I said, that we have to bear the risk, and that's the most difficult part. You've got communities who are living in bushfire-prone areas, and they've been there for a long time. As I said, you can't just tear the social fabric apart and tell people, "Oh, sorry," or you can't also say you're on your own. You have to bear the risk yourself. It's and I guess insurance will have a big say in that, because they're increasing premiums in California now. They're just all of a sudden you get your renewal notice and it says, "Sorry, we're not insuring you anymore." So ultimately, the government and we have to bear that risk for people, because thankfully we're living in a society where we care about people, and so we all have to collectively bear that risk and respond to it. But it's a difficult conversation to have, but we need to have it, because if we just keep sleepwalking into the future as we are now, we're just going to be hit with more and more events like this, and the impact's going to get larger and larger, and we just won't know what to do with it. None of this stuff is in any budget. All these responses to fires is just all coming on top of things, and then anyway. So.
Thank you. Melissa, there was a lot of trauma. There were a lot of people personally affected, and I'm sure there's a lot of young people looking at issues like the recent bushfires and connecting it up to drivers that will be important in their lifetimes. How do we better prepare for the kinds of trauma that come out of these events?
I think that's another complicated question. I think there's quite a lot of work done at the moment around helping people with immediate trauma, so setting up counselling services, and encouraging people to do all the kinds of things that you do when you are grief-stricken, which is, be with family, talk about it. There have been suggestions of doing exercise and walking and all sorts of things, the kind of psychology of dealing with trauma and grief, and I think that's one thing to think about. But the point that you pick up on, which I think is a wider question, is it's not just the people that have lost their houses or the people living in those communities that are experiencing forms of trauma or grief. It's, it might be people in this room, it's the people that have observed it, that are reading the news. The school kids are getting bombarded by this anxiety, and I think it's a really evolving area on how you cope with that. But again, at the moment, what seems to be is putting in, for example, educating people about what's actually happening, rather than and helping people to differentiate between fake news and real news, and what is the scale of the problem, and giving people bite-sized sort of things that they can focus on. Because I wouldn't want to be naive and say, communities can just adapt. It's like what you're saying, Holger, it's just not that easy anymore. There's no win-win in going forward. But there are wins that you can have, and there are ways that we can address that trauma. And I think good communications, lessening the fear, and putting in place the kind of things that psychologists and doctors and counsellors use, those proper mental health services, being funded is really, really important, particularly in rural communities where it might not just be fire, it might be drought and a whole lot of other issues that compound that mental health and depression.
Yeah, Holger.
This is way out of my comfort zone, but I've been to lots of conferences on this in the last few years, and I think the big point here is that these impacts last for years. There's this big push at the beginning to help people, and even it might be even weeks or months, but these impacts are felt for years, and so it's really, we need to support communities for the long term, and I think that's the thing where it tends to fade out of people's memories pretty quickly. So I think that's a big cost that we need to think about and really keep supporting communities.
Just wanted to add to that is that one of the things about it's like when someone at work or your friend, their relative dies and you're really immediately sympathetic, then it moves on, but they're still really miserable and upset. And I think a lot of this stuff is like that. It's like paying attention to beyond that period of time to how you build up wider systems that are going to help people when we're all going about our business as usual, but they're still in pain and suffering and grieving for what they've lost.
Mm. So some of these things, building codes and building and how we deal with things individually, they're very important. We also have the ability to act in the face of changing risks. Doug, what kinds of things can we do as citizens to act in the face of these changing risks, and especially when we're stimulated by things like the recent fires?
I think we've got a question now, and it comes back to the theory that I was presenting today about reconceptualising risk within our society and starting to talk about it with people in a different way. I think that would be part of the healing process, and also the preparatory process for young people. We're heading into a world where the type of environmental drivers of risk are going to change. We know that. All of our evidence is suggesting that. And so that's starting to have new conversations, looking at our curriculum and our education systems and how we can develop those significantly. I think more specifically, this raises really interesting questions about how we organise our settlements. There's not much we can do about the past, but we can start thinking differently about things like our transport routes and how transport access. We saw in this over the summer, even though we had very substantial fires across large areas, the actual fatalities was less than Ash Wednesday, for example. So we've probably improved the way we communicate risk. We've probably improved individual and collective responses, but still people were stuck in transport situations which were horrendous. And in some cases we were very lucky in relation to those. So transport is one area that I want to see starts to take into account this bushfire risk in a much more fundamental way. Other places around the world that have significant hazard risks like avalanches or floods don't just design their roads haphazardly in relation to those risks, they take them into account. We have to take into account bushfire risk to the same extent.
Thanks, Doug. We might be able to ask a couple of questions. Do we have microphones to go around? There's one here and one back here. So maybe start back there and then we'll come down the front.
Back in 1983, the Ash Wednesday fire then, that was, there was a scary story I heard where they said that if the wind had changed, the people in charge were going to try and stop the fire at Fullerton Road. Has anybody ever heard of, is it an urban myth? Has anybody ever heard of that? And maybe the second question, maybe you'd need a lawyer before you actually answered this one. If I bought a house on the eastern side of Adelaide, where would it be safe to get it?
Has anyone heard the myth?
I don't know that specific myth, but I've heard several presentations in the last few years by the Bureau of Meteorology about the potential for fire to go downhill in particular situations. And so those eastern suburbs, we always talk about fire rushing uphill and following the heat up, etc. But in the same way, their modelling and their experience is that fires can rush downhill in the same way. So those forested eastern suburbs of Adelaide arguably could be vulnerable to that type of situation. Where to go in that situation, I don't want to pick.
Holger, do you have something to add?
Modelling fire behaviour is really complicated. I mean, we look at floods, it's reasonably straightforward. If water flows downhill, you know where it goes and you know which areas are going to be flooded, and you know if the flood gets worse, you know which bits are inundated next. Fire, you know, obviously you need fuel, but you know, wherever there's fuel, you don't really know where the fire is going to go. It's a complex interaction of different factors, and so it's definitely conceivable, you know, that these areas are under threat. And it's also, by the same token, you can't really say where the safe line is, because that will definitely change in the future, and it depends on individual circumstances. So it's a very, fire is really complicated.
Thanks, Holger. Sure.
Question for Bob. When the fire actually can more or less sterilise the landscape, does seed collecting become a lot more important now, endemic species?
Yes, it does. Excuse me. There's quite a good seed bank of rare and endangered plant species in Australia. The challenge that we have now is that those seed banks were never designed for really mass seeding. So one of the plans that's at least in the embryonic stage is to turn some farmland over to effectively monocultures of individual species, so that we can build up the seed bank and be able to put seed back into those environments. The trouble is most of the species you're talking about will take at least 10 to 15 years to get to flowering. So this is a long-term project and goes against most of what we've talked about here, that you need to stay the distance to make that work. But certainly the plan is there and people are thinking about it. Yeah.
One more. Thanks.
What place does traditional burning have over modern methods of predicting where you should burn and how much and for how long? And should traditional burning have more of a say over modern prediction methods, but considering that they take in more data points, but also taking in the traditional?
So this is a question about what kind of evidence we want to use to determine what the right fire regimes are and how to bring traditional knowledge.
So I know that there's systems used to predict, to model where like fires will burn, and then you can counter burn to them, and then how much weight should we put on traditional methods, and should they have more weight than other modern methods of collecting data and utilising it?
Maybe Bob and Melissa.
Look, for what it's worth, you have to keep in mind that Indigenous people didn't burn the landscape because they were trying to reduce the fire risk. I mean, they burnt it for a particular purpose, and they burnt it when it wasn't covered in farmland and being used for other purposes as well. So we live in an entirely different world to what that was. And it's not necessarily appropriate to bring in something which was designed for one purpose and presume that it's going to work beautifully to solve the problem that we have right now. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't work, but it takes a lot of thinking through. And on top of that, at least in southern Australia, we've mostly lost the knowledge anyway. So, I understand where the push is coming from, and I have sympathy for it, but it's a lot more complicated than it first sounds.
Melissa?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the thing about traditional fire burning is that it's extremely place-based. So it's not the kind of knowledge system where you'd say there are some broad principles here and you can transport those principles to any piece of land in Australia. That knowledge is very much based in that Indigenous country. It's, you know, based on millennia of accumulated knowledge about that particular ecological region and how it operates over time. And so fire burning knowledge is fantastic when it's in that country and it's still surviving and it's applied. But you can't just uproot it and say, okay, I'm going to have a look at what it's going to be like in New South Wales now if it's from the Territory. So I think that's one dimension there. The other dimension, which I think we've all picked up on, is that we have new challenges now in the environment which have affected how and different land management techniques to what Indigenous peoples used, and so that has compounded and created a situation which is beyond traditional knowledge because it's, you know, a new knowledge, a new situation. And then I actually think it's important to say that we're entering a new situation again where all of us are confounded by what's happening in the landscape. And I think, you know, it's really good to think about what Doug was suggesting, is that partnerships, you know, with Indigenous peoples and place-based partnerships on their country could be really useful, but that we all together work out what the hell we're going to do in terms of future. And that might include fire burning, but it has to be a composite of the different knowledges, not just hope that one or the other's going to work out, I think.
Thanks, Melissa. I'd like to thank our panel now for a very well-rounded conversation. Thank you to Professor Hoggelmeyer, Associate Professor Melissa Nursey-Bray, Professor Bob Hill and Associate Professor Doug Bardsley. Thank you all also for coming and sharing insights through the website before you came so that we could construct a conversation, and for the questions that came late there as well. The Research Tuesdays continues, and the website's available for you to look at what's coming up and book in if you're interested in that and share with others. I hope that it's been useful tonight, and thanks very much for coming.